Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Welcome to Walking Through the Book of Exodus with Ruel Barksdale. I'm your host, and today we'll be looking at the first chapter. Now, last week we went through verses 1 through 7, and we'll pick up there. But before we do, just for context, let's revisit a few of the things that we talked about last week. Last week, when we started looking at the book of Exodus, we found that there were 400 years between the end of Genesis and the beginning of this phenomenal book. And in that 400 years, a lot has happened. And so when we look through the first seven verses of this first chapter of Exodus, we're going to see that a lot of change has gone on. We're going to start by looking at who started in this journey, and then we'll see why, when they died, things get a little bit ugly. All right, so let's read. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt, and Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali; Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. And so we look at the children of Jacob, numbering 70 people, the children of Israel, named 70 people. Of course, we know that Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Now, Joseph, in verse 6, Joseph, um, let's go to verse 5. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now, Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. All those people that I just named, Simeon and Levi and Reuben and Naphtali and Judah and Benjamin, all of them are dead. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king who did not know about Joseph. You see, Joseph had power. Joseph had prestige. Joseph had prominence, and Joseph had position. Why? Because when there was, you remember from Genesis, when there was a famine in the land, Joseph had wisdom and saved everybody. And so Pharaoh said, well, yeah, if you want your family to come up here so they don't die in the famine in Canaan, bring them up here so that they can live. And so they did. And they prospered. And so the question might be, well, why would God allow his chosen people to come up to Egypt where they would eventually be persecuted, prosecuted, punished? Why would God allow that? I mean, why would God allow people that were doing fine in the land that was promised to come into Egypt? We'll see. We'll not be able to answer that in this first chapter of Exodus. So let's go to verse 8 and we'll pick up where we left off last week. Then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, see, they were afraid of the Hittites coming down against them. If war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. Come on now. They're not like us. They don't worship the same gods that we worship. They don't look like we look. The color of their skin might be a little bit different. They're evil people and they're violent people. And if we don't do something to them because they're not like us, we'll be in trouble. They'll take over. Egypt won't be great like it used to be. Sound familiar? I've often wondered when you look at the New Testament and you see the martyrdom. You see those that were killed preaching and believing on the name of Christ. Tertullian writes, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And here we have Pharaoh setting up something that's going to become increasingly more evil. We got to do, whenever you have a leader that tries to dissect, divide, and determine an us and them mentality, them is never as good as us. The great philosopher Voltaire said that if you can get people to believe in absurdity, you can get them to commit an atrocity. The absurdity is we got to do something about them because they're evil, they're violent, they're not like us. And if we don't get control of them, Egypt won't be great again. Absurdity, the atrocities coming. Oh, let's go to verse 10. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. Why don't you want them to leave, Pharaoh? Because they're doing our work. They're working in our fields. They're building our cities. We got free labor. We don't want them to be emancipated. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses and store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter and hard with hard labor in brick and mortar with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. We got to control them. We'll put them to work building our nation. We'll put them to work doing the work that we don't want to do. We'll enslave them and we'll deal with them. We'll beat them. We'll have whips running across their back. We'll brutalize their women and their men and their children. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Zipporah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. What are you saying, Pharaoh? I want the infant mortality rate for the Egyptian boys to be extremely high. I don't want their boys growing into men. I don't have a prison system yet. I don't have a military where I'm drafting them yet. I haven't put alcohol stores and gun stores in their neighborhoods yet. And so the next best thing I can do is kill them as soon as they're born. And that's my order, midwives. When you see a young boy born to one, and why would Satan be so evil? Because Satan remembers the promise in Genesis 3:15. The seed of a woman will crush his head. And that seed is going to come from an Israelite. He remembers the promise. And so this is the first chance he gets. It might be in this generation. They're growing too big. There's too many of them now. I could deal with them when it was just Jacob and his 12 sons. I could deal with them when there were only 70 people. But now there are millions. I kill them all. What do you do when a society tries to destroy, devalue, and debilitate you? What do you do? What do you do when it seems like everything is against you? What you do is you trust God. You trust God. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. Why? Because they understood that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. They understood that even though they were afraid of Pharaoh, and they were, even though they understood Pharaoh's power, and he had it, even though they understood Pharaoh's ruthlessness, and he was, they feared God more. Last week we talked about Kohlberg's levels of moral development. And in that conversation, we said that there are three levels of moral development. The first level of moral development is when we do what we do in fear of punishment or in hopes of reward. It's all about me. It's internal focus. If I do this, what's going to happen to me? The Good Samaritan allows us to revisit that principle. What's going to happen to me? Two of them said, if I help this man, what's going to happen to me? So the first level of Kohlberg's levels of moral development is pre-conventional. What's going to happen to me? The second level of moral development is conventional. What does society expect me to do? What do my peers expect me to do? What do my parents expect me to do? What do my neighbors and friends expect me to do? What does the law say? What does the standard operating procedure say? What would make my boss happy? Conventional. It's not as internally focused. It's focused on expectations of society. If I don't maintain this order, what will happen? Society will break down. I got to do what the law says. But there is a third level of Kohlberg's levels of moral development, and it's called post-conventional. And in that level, the Samaritan doesn't ask, the people that see the Good Samaritan doesn't ask, what's going to happen to me if I help this man? The Good Samaritan says, what is going to happen to this man if I don't help him? Because in that third level of moral development, there's an understanding that there is a higher power, and the law, it's not always right. The Holocaust was legal, wasn't right. Slavery was legal, it wasn't right. The mass killings in Rwanda were legal, wasn't right. The inability to women to vote in this country before women's suffrage was legal, wasn't right. Calling a person 3/5 of a person as indicated by the Supreme Court of the United States of America was legal, but it was not right. The trail of tears leaving Native Americans dead as their land was stripped from them and they were marched from their land to reservations in the West was legal. It was not right. And there are times in life, there are times in a society where some will stand up and say, I fear man, I fear Pharaoh, but I fear God more. And these two midwives, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them. That the king, we know you're bad, king, but we fear God. And so you wonder how, when the king himself, when Pharaoh himself had declared that these people will die, how did they survive? If the battle had been between Pharaoh and God's people, Pharaoh would certainly have won because he had the resources, he had the military, he had the government, he had the power, but God's people had God. My brother, my sister, it doesn't matter what you're going through today. There might be a Pharaoh in your life. There might be situations where you wonder, how did I get here? How did I get into a situation where my nights are long and my days are short, when the tears are falling down my face and it seems like everything is against me? I can't get ahead. Sometimes God puts us in a place that's necessary for us to grow. If the children of Israel had not been in Egypt, there would have been intermingling with the Canaanites, and they would not have been able to grow and prosper as they did in Egypt, where they were isolated, separated, segregated. They had nobody but God. Have you ever been in a situation where it was a but God situation, where you had to depend on him? And in the midst of that oppression, in the midst of that segregation, in the midst of that humiliation, in the midst of that evil, God allows them to be in a place where they can grow. And they can grow in a way that their growth is not intermingling with the children of those that are worshiping other gods, singing other songs. So the midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew children are not like the Egyptian women, and they are vigorous and give birth before we can get there. Were they lying? Perhaps not, because when you are God's people, you don't do things in a natural way. You do things in a supernatural way. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, what'd he do? He gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people, not just the midwives, not just the people working in the hospital, not just the people in the medical profession. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. There is evil in the world, but I'm so glad that the scripture is true. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. It might hurt you, it might harm you, it might cause you pain. It won't prosper. Next week, my brother, my sister, we will look at, we'll go to chapter 2 in this phenomenal story in the book of Exodus. And we will see that God's people will prosper, and we will see a young man who was supposed to die, but God raises him out of the water. His name is Moses. Make sure you tune in next week when we meet this great man. I love you. God loves you more. See you next week.